For my event connection, I watched the iRise Diversity Summit talks, specifically focusing on Maria Islas Lopez's speech. Just in general, the overall idea of the Diversity Summit talks seemed to me to really encompass the idea of working towards equity and inclusive excellence, and recognizing the stigmas and myths that we come across when looking at students who are minorities. One of the main themes I saw in Dr. Islas Lopez's talk was her discussion about the future and how we think about the future and have aspirations for our future. She discussed not only how we have fear and tension arise from the power and fragility of our future imaginations, but also interestingly focused on the ways in which we engage our future and relate it back to our day-to-day experiences. From this, she gets into a conversation about voice and talks about things that shape this voice of ours. And as she's talking about voice and giving people voice, it reminded me of Ladson Billings' article on critical race theory, and how naming one's own reality and having a voice and telling stories is an important part of people who are oppressed to maintain their power and self-preserve when they're faced with discrimination and things that hold them back from reaching goals. This further relates to Dr. Islas Lopez's speech because she emphasizes the significance of aspirations, and critical race theory involves realizing the strengths of the oppressed and how often we shadow the strengths of minorities because of our own biases. A specific population she talks about is Mexican immigrant families. She hits on how the power of dreams and aspirations are important emotional and moral anchors that are necessary to motivate immigrant youth. However, thoughts for the future have implications. See, we make decisions based on the options we have available to us. The social and cultural surroundings and relationships we endure are critical for the kinds of plans we're able to create and achieve. When we take into account all of the obstacles that students of color face, we see large barriers that may prevent them from reaching their full potential. We have been examining many of these obstacles, especially in concurrence with the school-to-prison pipeline, which marginalize minority groups and limit their options for a bleaker future. For example, Ladson Billings highlights in her article, A Letter to Our Next President, that our society's histories have excluded certain groups of children from opportunities, and that things such as school funding is so disproportional that there's a serious lack of resources and materials necessary for equal success among groups of students. So as Dr. Islas Lopez explains how the conditions we face help shape how we think about our futures and whether we can achieve these futures, we see a serious inequality in our education system that doesn't provide a fair chance to foster inclusive excellence and therefore contributes to the continuation and exacerbation of the routes of the school-to-prison pipeline that minority students face. Elaborating on our ability to think about our future and have aspirations, Dr. Islas Lopez explains how we create plans for our future on the basis of what we've heard before, what we've seen before, what others say and expect of us, and what resources are available to us to fulfill our aspirations. We can draw heavily from the achievement gap and the discipline gap to show how these conditions can make it very difficult for marginalized groups of students to fulfill these aspirations and to avoid the school-to-prison pipeline. Gregory, Skiba, and Noguera look at these gaps in their article titled The Achievement Gap and the Discipline Gap, Two Sides of the Same Coin, and demonstrate how students of color are differentially selected and processed in unfair, subjective, and more severe ways that push them further and further away from the education they deserve and need to succeed. These negative expectations are further demonstrated by Gregory, Nygren, and Moran's article on the normalization of failure, that shows how the pattern of racial disparities in schools has become so consistent that failure and troubling gaps are seen to be normal and accepted. So if others' expectations of us go into how we achieve our aspirations, and these beliefs are negative and reflect an expectation of failure and unjust rationalizations for disparities, it becomes very difficult for minority students to envision an accomplished future. If these unequal circumstances and racialized systematic policies are putting these students at a disadvantage, they will underestimate their potential, and this will lower their supposed capacity to aspire. Dr. Islas Lopez argues that the capacity to aspire is about having equal access to material and resources. We have to equip people with the proper opportunities in order to achieve inclusive excellence, but unfortunately there are such things that impair our ability to do this.